You're kneeling beside a body wrapped in red ochre, and your hands are shaking as you place a small stone tool into the folded arms. The fire beside you has been burning for 6 days straight, and no one in the group has spoken above a whisper since the third morning. Somewhere behind you, someone begins a low, rhythmic sound that isn't quite singing and isn't quite crying. You don't know it yet, but what you're doing right now will still matter 100,000 years from now. Modern humans will spend an average of just 3 days away from work when a parent dies, and less than 24 hours for anyone outside their immediate family. Ancient humans, by contrast, sometimes carried the bones of their dead for years, revisiting them, cleaning them, speaking to them. Something essential seems to have been compressed, maybe even lost. So how did the earliest humans actually process the unbearable weight of loss? And why does grief still feel exactly the same to us today as it did 60,000 years ago? The oldest deliberate burial evidence comes from Khafsa Cave in Israel, where researchers led by archaeologist Arella Hovers documented bodies placed in fetal positions, with deer antlers resting on the chest, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago. This wasn't accidental. The positioning was consistent, careful, repeated across multiple individuals. It tells us that grief wasn't a single private emotion felt in isolation. It was something the whole group participated in, shaped, and gave form to through ritual. This is why you still feel the pull toward funerals, wakes, and shared mourning rituals today, even in a culture that often tells you to grieve quietly and move on quickly. Neanderthal sites add another layer entirely. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, anthropologist Ralph Selecki uncovered pollen clusters around a skeleton in the 1960s, later reinterpreted by researcher Chris Hunt in 2020 as possible evidence of flowers placed in the grave. Whether or not every detail holds up, the broader pattern across Shanidar remains. Bodies deliberately positioned, sometimes with objects nearby, sometimes with visible care in how the site was arranged. Neanderthals, not just modern humans, appear to have marked death as something significant. This is why the instinct to bring flowers to a funeral feels ancient rather than performative. You are not following an invented custom. You are repeating something that predates our own species. Grief itself may be older than ritual. Primatologist Jane Goodall documented chimpanzee mothers carrying dead infants for days, sometimes weeks, refusing to let go even as decomposition set in. Researcher Barbara King later expanded this into what she called animal grief, showing similar behavior in elephants, who return to the bones of dead relatives and touch them gently with their trunks. If grief exists in animals without language, without ritual, without belief in an afterlife, it suggests loss registers first in the body, then in the mind. This is why grief still feels physical to you today. The tight chest, the exhaustion, the fog, long before it becomes a thought you can articulate. Early human groups also treated death as a communal event rather than a private one. Anthropologist Louis Binford's work on hunter-gatherer mortuary practices found that small foraging bands, some numbering only 20 to 30 people, would pause all activity for days after a death. Hunting stopped, movement stopped, the entire social rhythm reoriented around the loss. In groups that small, every death was the loss of an irreplaceable set of skills, memories, and relationships. This is why losing someone still disrupts your entire routine, even in cities of millions, because your nervous system evolved in bands where one death changed everything. The body itself was marked in ways meant to be seen. Bioarchaeologist Ian Coit has studied Neolithic sites in the Levant where skulls were removed from buried bodies, plastered with clay to recreate facial features, and kept above ground in the home for months or years before eventual reburial. This wasn't macabre to the people who did it. It was a way of keeping the dead present in daily life, instead of removing them all at once. This is why so many people today still keep an urn on a shelf, a photograph on the wall, or a voicemail they cannot bring themselves to delete. The instinct to keep the dead visible, rather than instantly out of sight, is far older than any of us. Belief in continuity after death appears surprisingly early, too. Archaeologist Paul Pettit has argued that grave goods, tools, ochre, ornaments, buried alongside bodies, suggest that ancient humans imagined some form of ongoing existence, a journey rather than an ending. This wasn't necessarily organized religion. It may have simply been an emotional refusal to accept that a person could vanish completely. This is why so many modern grieving rituals, lighting candles, keeping ashes, visiting graves, still center on the idea of maintaining a connection rather than severing one. Mourning also had a clear time signature in ancient life. Anthropologist Renato Rizaldo, studying grief among the Ilongot people of the Philippines, found that mourning periods were bounded, intense, and communally witnessed, often lasting weeks with specific rituals marking the end. There was a beginning, a middle, and a socially recognized close. Grief had permission to exist fully before it was expected to fade. This is why unresolved grief today, grief without ritual, without witnesses, without a clear ending, so often turns into something heavier and harder to release. The fear underneath the ritual may be just as old as the ritual itself. Psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pazinski developed what they call terror management theory, showing through decades of experiments that reminders of death measurably change human behavior, pushing people toward tighter group loyalty, stronger belief systems, and a deeper need for meaning. Ancient burial practices may have served this same psychological function, giving mortality a shape people could manage, rather than an abyss they had to face raw and unprotected. This is why, even now, loss doesn't just make you sad, it makes you search for meaning, for belief, for something solid to hold on to. Even the sound of grief followed patterns passed down for generations. Ethnomusicologist Ellen Basso documented ritual wailing among the Kalapalo people of Brazil, a structured, almost musical form of crying performed at gatherings, distinct from ordinary tears, and clearly recognized by everyone present as a formal act of mourning. Similar traditions of professional or communal wailing appear across dozens of ancient and indigenous cultures, from the Keeners of Ireland to funeral criers documented in ancient Mesopotamian texts. Grief, in these traditions, wasn't something to suppress into silence. It was something to release loudly, together, with the whole community bearing witness to the sound of loss. This is why a broken voice, a wail, or an uncontrollable sob still feels more honest to us than composed, quiet sadness, even in a culture that often prizes keeping it together. The turning point came when human groups grew too large and too fast for shared mourning to scale. Agriculture settled people into permanent villages, then cities, then nations, and death became something managed rather than witnessed. Funeral homes replaced communal burial. Bereavement policy replaced open-ended mourning. Grief, once a process the entire group carried together, became something an individual is now expected to handle quietly, efficiently, and largely alone, often returning to a desk within days of the loss. What hasn't changed is the ache itself. The body still wants to sit with the dead a little longer. The mind still wants permission to stop, to not perform normalcy, to mark the absence out loud. Ancient humans built entire rituals around one simple truth we've quietly forgotten. Grief was never meant to be efficient. It was meant to be witnessed.